The morning sun, still shy and cool, filtered through the kitchen window, painting stripes across the worn wooden table as Leo meticulously arranged his gear. Each item was chosen with the precision of a surgeon and the reverence of a pilgrim. His well-worn backpack lay open like a hungry maw, ready to swallow the day's necessities. 2 liters of water, a pouch of dried fruit and nuts, a multi-tool, a compact first aid kit, and a meticulously folded paper map of Whispering Pines. He always carried a physical map, a rebellion against the fickle signals of the digital world. The compass, the familiar balm of pine and damp earth, embraced Leo as he stepped onto the narrow trail. Sunlight fractured through the towering canopy of the Whispering Pines, stippling the forest floor with shifting gold. This was his refuge, where the city's incessant drone receded into a faint echo, supplanted by the gentle soughing of leaves and the soft percussion of his boots. He drew a deep breath, inhaling the crisp, restorative air, a tonic for his restless spirit. His pack settled comfortably, its familiar heft promising autonomy. He'd trod these paths countless times, each excursion a moving meditation. The sheer grandeur of the trees never failed to humble him, ancient titans reaching skyward, their rough bark a chronicle of silent centuries. He adjusted the brim of his cap, a faint smile playing on his lips. This communion with nature was precisely what he craved. Yet, as he ventured deeper, a subtle unease began to curdle the peace. The usual woodland chorus was strikingly absent. No avian melodies, no squirrel chatter, no distant woodpecker's rhythm. The air, typically vibrant with the subtle thrum of insects, felt uncannily still. He paused, head cocked, listening intently. Nothing. Only the muted pulse of his own heart, and the breeze's sigh through the pine needles, which now sounded less like a gentle song, and more like a hushed confidence. Leo, usually quick to dismiss his anxieties as overthinking, found this quietude tenacious, almost deliberate. It wasn't the lull of a momentarily paused orchestra, it was the eerie emptiness of a deserted hall. He scoured the undergrowth, his sharp gaze seeking any flicker of movement, any trace of life. A snapped twig, a disturbed moss patch, anything to disrupt the unnerving perfection of the stillness. But the forest floor lay pristine, a flawless mosaic of fallen leaves and verdant moss. He resumed his trek, his steps growing more deliberate, his senses acutely sharpened. The initial tranquility was slowly mutating into something else, a prickle of foreboding that crept up his spine. He reached a familiar curve in the path, a spot where an ancient oak, scarred by lightning, always offered a comfortable perch. His eyes habitually sought a low-slung branch, a gnarled arm extending towards the trail, and then he saw it. Nestled on a patch of lichen-covered bark was a small, intricately carved wooden bird. No larger than his thumb, it was rendered with remarkable precision. Tiny wings, a delicate beak, and even miniature eyes that gleamed with a faint, polished sheen. The wood was a dark, rich mahogany, smooth to the touch, and it felt surprisingly cool against his fingertips when he carefully lifted it. Leo frowned. He'd never encountered this before. He had stopped at this very spot hundreds of times. This branch, this specific knot of wood, was as ingrained in his memory as his own hand. There was no way he would have overlooked something so distinct. It wasn't weathered or faded, implying its recent placement. But who would leave such an object out here? And why? He turned the tiny sculpture over in his palm, admiring the exquisite craftsmanship. It was undeniably beautiful, a miniature marvel. A curious anomaly, he mused, shrugging off the oddness. Perhaps a hiker had dropped it, or intentionally left it as a trail marker, though it seemed too precious for such casual abandonment. He tucked it carefully into the breast pocket of his shirt, the small, cool weight, a new presence close to his heart. The quiet of the woods, however, remained, and for the first time, Leo felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the crisp forest air. The familiar path, worn smooth by countless boots, stretched ahead, predictable in its gentle ascent. Leo paused, the morning sun dappling through the canopy, painting shifting patterns on the forest floor. He'd walked this trail a dozen times, savored its quiet beauty, but today, a restlessness pricked at him. A whisper of a different route, rumored to cut through the denser woods, snagged his attention. Old Man Hemlock, who ran the general store back in town, had once mumbled something about a deer trail that branched off near the old logging camp, a shortcut only a fool or an expert tracker would attempt. Leo, with his healthy dose of both curiosity and stubbornness, found himself drawn to the challenge. He consulted his map again, though the rumored shortcut wasn't marked. The logging camp was roughly a mile in, a derelict collection of rusted machinery and crumbling shacks. He decided then, a grin spreading across his face, a decision born of impulsive adventurism. New paths, new discoveries. That's what hiking was truly about. Reaching the camp, he veered left, pushing through a tangle of overgrown ferns and thorny bushes, where no obvious path presented itself. The air instantly cooled, the light dimming as the trees grew impossibly tall, their branches intertwining overhead like a vaulted cathedral ceiling. The scent of damp earth and pine needles deepened, more pungent, more primal. He pressed on, relying on instinct and the subtle lean of the land, imagining the path that should be there, forging one where it wasn't. Minutes bled into what felt like an hour. The forest here was different. The trees were ancient, their bark crusted with moss, their roots snaking across the ground like petrified serpents. The silence was profound, broken only by the crunch of his boots on fallen leaves and the distant muffled caw of a crow. He pulled out his compass, a sturdy brass instrument he'd owned for years, and held it steady. The needle, usually so resolute in its north-seeking, began to twitch. A slight tremor at first, then a full-blown jitter, spinning erratically, clockwise then counterclockwise, as if caught in a magnetic storm. His brow furrowed. He shook it gently, tapped the glass. No change. It continued its frenzied dance for a full minute before, with an almost audible sigh, it settled. Not on north but on a point roughly northwest. At least 45 degrees off his expected bearing. A prickle of unease, cold and sharp, traced its way up his spine. He tried his phone. No signal. He wasn't surprised by that, not really. Deep woods often chewed up cell service. But the compass, that was less common. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe a geological anomaly. Some iron ore deposits deep underground skewing the magnetic field. Or perhaps the old logging camp had left behind some metallic residue, distorting the local magnetism. He even considered the idea that the compass itself, a faithful companion for so many trips, had finally decided to give up the ghost. It was old after all. He slipped the erratic compass back into his pocket, his phone still stubbornly displaying no service. He forced a deep breath, the chill air filling his lungs. It was just the deep woods, he told himself, the wilder side of nature he'd sought out. Nothing more. But the silence seemed heavier now, the shadows longer, and the feeling that he wasn't alone, a sensation he usually cherished in the wilderness, now felt like a distinct, unsettling presence. He pushed forward, his initial adventurous zeal now tempered by a nascent unease, the strange signs echoing in the cavernous quiet. The late afternoon sun, usually a welcome friend, now cast long skeletal shadows through the ancient canopy. Leo, having navigated the familiar winding trail for hours, paused, his hand instinctively going to the canteen at his hip. That's when he heard it. A faint, ethereal melody, like tiny crystal bells chiming in the distance, each note shimmering and then dissolving into the dense air. It was beautiful, impossibly so, and utterly out of place. There wasn't a breath of wind to stir a single leaf, let alone cause anything to chime. The air hung still and heavy, pregnant with a strange quietude. A sudden prickle crawled up his neck, a sensation akin to an unseen gaze boring into his back. He spun around, eyes scanning the deep greens and browns of the undergrowth, his backpack rustling softly against his jacket. Nothing. Just the endless, interwoven tapestry of trees, each one a silent sentinel. He took a few steps off the path, pushing aside a curtain of ferns, peering into the gloom. Still nothing. No rustle of an animal, no flash of a bird, not even the buzz of an insect. The feeling, however, persisted, a cold, unwavering pressure between his shoulder blades. He was being watched, he was certain of it. Yet, the forest revealed no observer, only its own profound, unsettling stillness. Returning to the narrow dirt track, his gaze fell upon something extraordinary. Nestled among the scattered pine needles and fallen leaves, directly in his path, lay a stone. It was small, no larger than a robin's egg, perfectly spherical, its surface impossibly smooth, like polished jade. And it glowed, not with a harsh, artificial luminescence, but with a soft, inner light, a gentle pulse of pale blue that seemed to emanate from within its core. Curiosity, a driving force he often found impossible to resist, superseded his unease. He knelt, extending a hesitant finger. The stone felt cool to the touch, yet as his fingers closed around it, a strange warmth bloomed in his palm, spreading subtly up his arm. It wasn't unpleasant, merely unexpected. He slipped it into the small zippered pocket of his cargo pants, the warmth persisting, a comforting weight against his thigh. As he continued, the melody, if it had ever truly been there, faded, replaced by an even more profound quiet. It wasn't the usual hush of a deep forest, alive with the subtle hum of unseen life. This was different. This was a silence so absolute it felt unnatural, like a vacuum. He strained his ears, listening for the familiar chatter of squirrels, the scuttling of unseen creatures in the underbrush, the distant call of a hawk, even the incessant drone of cicadas. There was nothing. No chirp, no buzz, no rustle, no distant hoot. The air itself seemed to have absorbed all sound, leaving only the dull thud of his own footsteps on the soft earth and the frantic beat of his heart. The absence of sound was more unnerving than any noise could have been. It felt wrong, fundamentally askew. Animals, even the most cautious, rarely remained silent for so long, not in such a vast expanse of woods. A shiver, unrelated to the cooling air, traced its way down his spine. The forest, his sanctuary, had become something else entirely. It felt empty, and he was very much alone. The realization hit Leo like a cold splash of water. He'd gone too far. The strange, almost hypnotic pull that had guided him deeper into the woods now receded, replaced by a growing unease. He spun on his heel, ready to retrace his steps, to find the familiar bend in the trail, the moss-covered rock he'd used as a landmark. But the path wasn't there. Where a clear, albeit overgrown track had led him just moments before, now stood an impenetrable wall of ferns and tangled undergrowth. He blinked, swiping a hand across his eyes, convinced he was mistaken. He must have veered off. He took a few steps to his right, pushing aside a thick curtain of ivy, then a few to his left. Nothing. Just more dense, unchanging woodland. The trees, once a comforting canopy, now loomed, their trunks thick and uniform, their branches intertwined in a dizzying lattice overhead. A prickle of alarm started at the base of his spine. This wasn't right. He was certain he hadn't wandered from the main trail. He remembered the precise angle of the sun filtering through the leaves, the distinctive call of a scarlet tanager he'd paused to identify. But now, the sunlight seemed to diffuse evenly from all directions, and the only sounds were the rustle of leaves and the increasingly frantic thumping of his own heart. He tried to recall the specific details of his journey inward. The double-trunked oak, the small stream he'd hopped over. He closed his eyes, picturing the landscape, trying to map it in his mind. When he opened them again, the scenery seemed to have subtly shifted. A cluster of birches he was sure had been to his left was now directly ahead. The shadows lengthened and deepened with an unnatural speed, painting the forest floor in stark contrasts. It was as if the very geometry of the woods was rearranging itself around him. Panic, cold and insidious, began to seep into his veins. He had never truly been lost before. Not like this. He was an experienced hiker, meticulously prepared, always aware of his surroundings. This wasn't a matter of misreading a map. This felt deliberate. He started to walk, then jog, then ran, crashing through the undergrowth, branches slapping at his face, twigs snapping underfoot. Every direction he chose led him deeper into the identical maze of ancient trees and thick brush. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something vaguely metallic and unsettling. "Hello," he shouted, his voice cracking. The sound was immediately swallowed, muffled as if a thick blanket had been thrown over him. It didn't echo, didn't carry. It simply died flat and unheeded, barely reaching beyond his own lips. He tried again, louder this time, a raw, desperate cry. "Is anyone there? I'm lost!" Again, the eerie silence descended, absorbing his words, leaving him feeling utterly, terrifyingly alone. It was more than just sound dampening. It was as if the forest itself was actively refusing to let his voice escape. The trees seemed to lean in, their rough bark indistinguishable from one another, their leaves rustling with an almost conspiratorial whisper. He could feel the cold sweat trickling down his temples, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The calm, observant Leo was dissolving, replaced by a primal fear he hadn't known he possessed. He looked up, searching for a break in the canopy, a glimpse of blue sky, anything to orient himself. But the interlocking branches formed an unbroken, verdant ceiling, obscuring the world beyond. He was truly, utterly, lost in the labyrinth. And the labyrinth seemed to be tightening its grip. The quiet hum in Leo's pocket, a subtle vibration from the ancient stone, had become a constant companion. A low, thrumming pulse beneath his fingertips. He'd barely registered it at first, a faint phantom buzz, but now, as he pushed deeper into the woods, it seemed to intensify, resonating with something unseen. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. Sunlight, once a dappled blessing, now struggled to penetrate the dense canopy, casting long, distorted shadows that danced with every rustle of the unseen wind. He rounded a cluster of moss-draped boulders, his gaze sweeping the gnarled trunks of ancient oaks. That's when he saw them. Not scratches, not natural blemishes, but deliberate carvings. Strange, spiraling symbols, interlocking lines and geometric shapes, etched into the bark. They weren't new. The moss had begun to reclaim their edges, but what truly startled him was the faint, internal glow emanating from within their grooves. It was the same ethereal luminescence as the stone in his pocket, a pale, almost phosphorescent light that pulsed subtly, like a slow, deep breath. He ran a hand over the rough bark, the stone's warmth radiating through his jeans, mirroring the cool, almost electric tingle beneath his fingertips on the carvings. He looked back, trying to recall if they'd been there on his way in, but the memory was a blur of indistinguishable trees. No, he was certain he would have noticed these. Lost in thought, his foot caught on an exposed root, sending him sprawling. His elbow landed hard, a jolt of pain shooting up his arm, but his attention was immediately drawn to the disturbance his fall had created. The impact had dislodged a thick carpet of autumn leaves, revealing a patch of dark, freshly turned soil. And nestled within it, partially buried, was a small, crudely fashioned wooden box. It was no larger than his hand, dark with age, its surface rough and unpolished. A strange sense of foreboding, a prickling sensation on his skin, urged him to leave it, to walk away, but his curiosity, a powerful, unyielding force, won out. With trembling fingers he dug around it, freeing it from its earthy embrace. The wood felt impossibly old, smooth in places where countless hands must have touched it. There was no latch, no hinge, just a tightly fitted lid. He pried it open with his thumbnail, a faint, almost imperceptible creak echoing in the sudden silence of the woods. Inside, folded and brittle with time, were several pieces of what looked like bark, smoothed and flattened, covered in faded charcoal drawings. He carefully unfolded the top piece. The drawings were unsettlingly primitive. Stick figures, their limbs elongated and disproportionate, held hands in a wide, unbroken circle. Their faces were featureless, blank ovals. But it was what they surrounded that made Leo's breath catch in his throat. A massive, amorphous shape, darker than the deepest shadows, dominated the center of the drawing. It had no discernible features, just a vast, consuming blackness that seemed to absorb the light around it, even on the faded bark. A shiver, not from the cold, traced a path up his spine. He quickly refolded the bark, the images seared into his mind. He glanced up, an instinctive urge to scan his surroundings. And there it was again. Perched on a high branch of a towering pine, silhouetted against a sliver of pale sky, was the carved wooden bird. The same one he'd seen earlier, or one identical to it. Its vacant, painted eyes seemed fixed on him, an unnerving stillness to its posture. He swore it hadn't been there a moment ago. He stood, clutching the wooden box, his heart hammering against his ribs. The carved symbols on the trees around him pulsed with a slightly brighter glow, and the stone in his pocket thrummed, a frantic, insistent rhythm. He felt a profound sense of being observed, a chilling certainty that he was no longer alone in these silent, ancient woods. The bird remained motionless, a silent sentinel, its presence an unsettling whisper in the growing quiet. The crisp, autumn air which had been so invigorating just an hour ago now felt sharp, almost predatory. A shiver, not entirely from the chill, traced its way down Leo's spine. The sun, still high and bright, seemed to mock the sudden drop in temperature. It was as if a pocket of winter had settled over this particular patch of woods, an invisible, frigid wall. He pulled his thin jacket tighter, the nylon rustling softly. Then came the whispers. At first he dismissed them as the wind sifting through the leaves, a common enough sound in the dense forest. But they grew clearer, more distinct, soft and insistent, like 1,000 hushed voices just beyond the edge of hearing. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, a disembodied chorus that spoke no intelligible words, yet carried a current of profound unease. It wasn't a language, not truly, but a feeling, a pervasive sense of being watched, assessed, and perhaps even desired. A prickle of fear, cold and sharp, began to uncoil in his gut. He quickened his pace, desperate to outrun the spectral murmurings. His boots crunched over fallen leaves and snapped twigs, the sound echoing unnaturally loud in the sudden quiet of the forest. He glanced back, then forward, scanning the familiar towering pines, the gnarled oaks. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. The path, which he'd been following diligently for hours, now looked different. The same fallen log, the same oddly shaped boulder he'd passed this morning, now stood directly in front of him. A knot of dread tightened in his stomach. He'd seen that log, that boulder, hours ago. He knew he had. A cold dread seeped into his bones as he spotted them. The distinctive tread of his own hiking boots, pressed into the damp earth, visible through a sparse patch of leaves. They formed a perfect, unbroken circle. His own footprints from hours ago now lay directly in his path. He had been walking in circles for hours. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs. He wasn't just disoriented, he was trapped. The whispers intensified, morphing into a low, insidious chuckle that seemed to vibrate in the very air around him. Panic, raw and unadulterated, clawed at his throat. He was lost. Truly, irrevocably lost. The woods, once his sanctuary, had become a labyrinth designed to ensnare him. He stumbled, catching himself on a low-hanging branch, his heart hammering against his ribs. Despair threatened to overwhelm him. He pushed on, driven by a primal instinct to escape, to find anything that wasn't the same repeating pattern of trees and undergrowth. The whispers grew louder, closer, almost breathing down his neck. Then, abruptly, the trees thinned. Not gradually, but as if a colossal hand had simply scooped them away. He burst through a curtain of thick evergreens and stopped dead, his breath catching in his throat. Before him lay a clearing. Not the sun-dappled, wildflower-strewn clearings he knew, but something else entirely. Ancient twisted trees, their bark a dark, almost black hue, formed a perfect, unbroken circle around it, their branches gnarled and reaching like skeletal fingers. Their leaves, though still clinging, were a deep, unsettling purple, not the vibrant autumn reds or yellows of the surrounding forest. The ground within the circle was bare earth, dark and smooth, devoid of any leaf litter or undergrowth. And in the absolute center, dominating the space, stood a monolithic stone. It was impossibly smooth, obsidian dark, reflecting the faint sunlight with an unnerving sheen. It stood taller than two men, broad and thick, and its surface was covered in a lattice of glowing symbols. They pulsed with an inner luminescence, a soft, ethereal blue that seemed to hum in the silent air, They weren't hieroglyphs, he recognized, nor any ancient script he'd ever studied. They writhed and shifted, a living constellation of light against the black stone, drawing his gaze, compelling him forward. A strange magnetic pull emanated from the stone, a silent call that resonated deep within his bones, silencing the whispers that had tormented him. It was terrifying, yes, but also, undeniably, terrifyingly beautiful. The air around Leo crackled, no longer a faint hum but a growing crescendo of hushed murmurs. They weren't random whispers, though. They wove together, forming incomplete phrases, snatches of sound that teased his comprehension. Ancient, path, return. He strained to grasp the full meaning, but the words shimmered on the edge of understanding, like heat haze distorting a distant object. Deeper in his pocket, the smooth, cool stone he'd found earlier pulsed with an almost alarming intensity. It vibrated against his thigh, a persistent thrum that mirrored the increasing pressure in his ears. It wasn't merely vibrating now, it felt as though it was pulling him, a tiny, insistent magnet guiding him forward. He reached the edge of the clearing, the massive, irregular monolith dominating the space before him. Its surface, a mottled gray, seemed to ripple. It wasn't a trick of the light. The stone itself appeared to be in a state of flux, and within its depths, faint, shimmering outlines began to coalesce. They were humanoid, or at least, suggested a human form but ethereal, like figures made of heat and moonlight. They drifted, slow and deliberate, their movements graceful and silent. They didn't appear to notice him, or if they did, they gave no indication. A strange sensation washed over Leo. The thumping panic that had ridden shotgun with him for days, the gnawing anxiety about being lost, about the sheer impossibility of his situation. It all receded. It wasn't a sudden amnesia, more like a gentle tide pulling back from the shore, leaving behind a tranquil calm. The fear dissolved, replaced by an odd sense of inevitability, as though this moment, this encounter, had been predestined. His breath deepened, evening out, and the frantic beat of his heart slowed to a steady rhythm. The murmurs around him, though still present, no longer felt menacing. They were simply there, part of the landscape, like the rustle of leaves, or the distant call of a bird. Without conscious thought, his hand went to his pocket. The small round stone, almost burning against his skin, launched itself from his grasp. It shot through the air, a blur of gray, not arcing like a thrown object but moving with a direct, unnatural trajectory towards the monolith. It struck the massive stone not with a clang or a thud, but with a silent ripple. The small stone didn't bounce off, it sank into the surface of the monolith, like a pebble dropped into still water. The ripples spread, not across the stone's surface, but through its very substance, radiating outwards from the point of impact. As the small stone merged, the shimmering figures within the monolith seemed to stir, their languid movements quickening. Their forms became slightly more distinct, and Leo could almost make out faint, luminous eyes. And then he saw it, a subtle, almost imperceptible gesture, a slow, beckoning movement from one of the figures, then another, and another. They were calling to him. There was no sound, no spoken word, but the invitation was clear. An undeniable pull that resonated deep within him. Leo took a step forward. Then another. His boots made no sound on the forest floor, and the air, once thick with the unintelligible whispers, now hummed with a singular resonant frequency that seemed to vibrate in his very bones. He felt no compulsion, no external force pushing him, only an internal draw, a profound sense of rightness. The fear was gone, replaced by a quiet wonder. He was no longer a lost hiker. He was simply Leo, drawn inexorably towards a mystery that promised not danger, but revelation. He walked slowly, deliberately, towards the pulsating heart of the monolith, towards the figures that waited, towards the merge. Each step brought him closer to the shimmering veil, closer to whatever lay beyond. The crisp autumn air, once a refreshing balm, now felt like a chokehold around Eleanor's throat. Each passing hour stretched into an eternity, marked by the ever-present drone of distant search helicopters and the hushed, anxious murmurs of volunteers gathering outside the forest's edge. Her practical mind, usually so adept at compartmentalizing and problem-solving, was splintering under the relentless weight of Leo's absence. She paced the perimeter of the makeshift command center, her gaze fixed on the impenetrable wall of pines, imagining horrors, then quickly swatting them away, only for new, equally terrifying ones to take root. Despair, a cold, creeping fog threatened to engulf her. Sheriff Brody, a man whose features usually held the stoic resolve of granite, showed the strain of the relentless search. His eyes, though weary, still held a determined glint. He barked orders into a crackling radio, his voice a gravelly reassurance to the dozens of searchers fanning out through the dense undergrowth. Maps were spread across the hood of his cruiser, marked with grid lines and circled areas, a testament to the extensive ground already covered. Dogs barked, their eagerness belying the futility of their efforts thus far. "We're not giving up, Elena," he'd told her earlier, his hand firm on her shoulder, but the conviction in his voice seemed to thin with each passing sunset. As dusk settled, painting the western sky in hues of bruised purple and orange, Mr. Silas emerged from the shadows of a towering oak, a silent sentinel watching the frantic activity. His gaze, ancient and knowing, rested on Eleanor, then swept across the forest. "You won't find him that way, Sheriff," he rumbled, his voice like stones tumbling down a mountainside. Brody, exasperated, turned. "And how do you suggest we find him, Silas? Call on the Five Folk?" he retorted, a hint of sarcasm lacing his words. Mr. Silas merely shook his head, a faint, melancholic smile playing on his lips. "The forest, it takes what it wants. Always has. Some things, they just vanish. Whispering Pines isn't just a name, Sheriff. It's a promise, and sometimes, a warning. These woods, they got old powers. Powers older than any of us." He gestured vaguely towards the dark canopy. "They say it's a place where the veil is thin, where what's real and what ain't, sometimes, gets jumbled up." Elena, though skeptical, found a chill crawling up her spine. The old man's words, unsettling as they were, resonated with the inexplicable void Leo had left. Days blurred into nights. The choppers eventually ceased their thrumming. The eager barks of the dogs dwindled, replaced by the somber silence of defeat. Sheriff Brody, his shoulders slumped, finally made the call. The search was officially called off. The news hung heavy in the air, a shroud over the small community. Elena felt a part of her soul shrivel and die. Then, just as the last volunteer vehicles were pulling away, a lone hiker, a seasoned tracker who'd been covering the perimeter, let out a startled cry. By the original trail entrance, the very spot Leo had first ventured into the woods, lay his backpack. It wasn't tossed aside or ripped open by animals. It was placed neatly, almost deliberately, at the base of a gnarled pine. On top, glinting faintly in the fading light, was a single, perfectly carved wooden bird. Its wings were outstretched, poised as if for flight, its details so intricate, they suggested hours of painstaking work. It was not a bird Elena recognized, nor one Leo had ever shown her. Its smooth, polished surface felt cool beneath her trembling fingers. Sheriff Brody examined the backpack, then the bird. No signs of struggle, no footprints other than the tracker's own. The woods had given back a token, a quiet, inexplicable message. The town grappled with the unanswerable. Was it a prank? A clue? A final, cryptic goodbye? No one knew. Leo Vance, a vibrant, adventurous young man, had become another whisper in Whispering Pines Forest, a ghost story told in hushed tones, another unexplained disappearance in a long line of them, leaving behind only a perfectly carved wooden bird and a profound, aching silence.